that the Russians are taking a look at, and they're concerned about it, that we could have our own version of what's called escalate to de-escalate. That we may say we're going to use tactical nuclear weapons to show that we're serious so that nobody uses theater nuclear weapons. That is apparently one of the doctrines that Vladimir Putin has in his pocket, whereas the escalate to de-escalate. Now, when you have two nuclear powers that both have a version of escalate to de-escalate, then you obviously have the problem that if anyone uses a nuclear weapon, then the other side is going to have to be the adult in the room, and to not escalate things further, not to meet nuclear for nuclear, but just, okay, let's just have sane heads here and let's don't get into strategic nuclear forces, because once we get to that, it's game over for everybody. Life as we know it will cease to exist. Whatever survives from one of these mutually assured destruction where missiles are flying back and forth, the planet will likely never recover, at least in anyone's lifetimes that's alive right now, whoever happens to survive. So the thought being, let's don't get there. Well, the problem is with that requires, if anyone, whether Russia or the United States, uses a tactical nuclear weapon first, in the thought that's going to deter the other side, you have people that are afraid on the other side. And the hope that they get the right message and do the right thing, so-called, is a gamble. It's just like, it's like one of those roulette wheels, and you're putting all of your money on one number, and you have no idea where that marble is going to land. You just hope it's good, but you see that the much more higher probability that it goes bad than it goes good. Don't find out. Do not go there. If the United States uses a nuclear weapon first, it's going to, the world will never be the same afterward. If Russia does the same thing first, nobody is going to win from this, folks. Nobody. So both sides need to back down and stop talking so much about all this nuclear weapons. And because the problem is that when you're the mental threshold, to the point that article made, I think it's accurate, and this applies to both sides equally. When your mental threshold continues to come down from which you're going to use, might use a nuclear weapon, then that does make it easier. So then now that when something happens outside, your willingness to use it, it's down this far instead of it's this far instead of this far, or up here, which should be way over here. It should only be considered if it's an absolute existential threat, that it's either use this or we're all going to die kind of situation. That's what nuclear weapons are supposed to have been for ever since they were first used in 1945. Is that all the nations that have whatever it is, I think 7 or 8 right now, official nuclear powers, the idea is that you only use them for an existential threat, and that's why there's been a lot less interstate conflict between the major powers, because they both know that their nuclear weapons exist, so that they are deterring themselves from having that kind of conflict. Well, we're obviously with this proxy war where we're using Ukraine as the cudgel against Russia, and all of NATO is helping Ukraine fight against Russia without having their own troops. We're just right up to the edge of it anyway. And the concern is that if we keep talking this way, we keep moving weapons around here. Russia's done the same thing too, by the way. Several times throughout this war, I think I've shown some even on the channel here, where Russia will move some of its mobile nuclear weapons launchers around, and they'll video that. So this is going on both sides. It's unhealthy, it's unhelpful, and it could be catastrophic. This all needs to stop, because if the one time that anybody uses a nuclear weapon, that genie's out of the bottle. This is not like 1945 where we had the exclusive use of it. Now there's a bunch of different players here, and God only knows what would happen if anyone uses it, especially against another nuclear power. Okay, that's not the only thing going on. That's not even the only thing going on here in the Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine itself, and we've been talking to you a lot about the Pokrovsk and the Kostyantynivka areas. Well, the Wall Street Journal has a piece out right now that says, inside Ukraine's effort to fortify hundreds of miles of defensive lines. The article notes the Ukraine is now hoping that installing a triple row of fortifications will prevent similar breakthroughs to the east, where Russia is pushing to capture the key cities of Pokrovsk and Kostyantynivka. but gaps in the entrenchments have prompted some soldiers to warn that a patchy defensive belt could end up like the Maginot Line, the ambitious French fortifications that were bypassed by the Germans in World War II. So what this is telling you is that the Ukraine side is having lots of trouble continuing to build fortifications. I've shown you on the map several times here just recently how Pokrovsk and Kostyantynivka, which are basically the hinges upon which the entire Eastern Front pivots, are both in semi-cauldrons already, and it won't be much longer. In fact, the Russians are going further into the city of Pokrovsk itself. They're coming in the north. They're moving to cut it off further up into Rodinska, etc. And in Kostyantynivka, likewise, with the capture of Chasiv Yar fully yesterday. Now then, it's an easier path for Russia to continue to try and cut that off. If either of those two gets cut off, then, of course, that opens the path for Russia to continue to move more. So what the Ukrainian side is doing is recognizing that risk, and so they're trying to build additional fortifications, and they're trying to build more of those triple lines of trenches and dragon's teeth and all kinds of stuff. Problem is, they don't have enough manpower to take care of all that. And they don't have enough resources either to be able to fight the war and build defensive trenches in the past. And as they said there, the Maginot Line, if you're not familiar with that, that's from World War II, where the French had built this elaborate, hundreds of miles long of various fortifications, trench lines, pillboxes, etc., that would have supposed to be preventing the Germans from invading France. Well, what they ended up doing was they went into an area where it was not quite finished. It wasn't quite as thick as the other places, where in terrain where the French didn't think they would be able to break through, and the Germans, of course, did. And then once they penetrated that line, which is something I've been talking to you about for months now of my concern, because once the Germans broke through that, they got into the rear of the area where now then the French didn't have any more fortifications because they thought that line was going to stop them. And once the Germans got behind them, then now the entire front line rolled up, the entire British and French defending armies in France. And that's one of my concerns that I've had here, is that if Russia breaks through some of these places, that could be the concern. Well, obviously, that's the concern on the Ukraine side as well. And now you see even the Wall Street Journal is putting some coverage to it, that is a growing problem. And here's the issue that you need to understand: the dynamics that are causing this patchy work, as they call it, and they're concerned, are only going to get worse. There's nothing on the horizon that can flip this around. There's just no more money to come that's going to come from the West, and not in the scale that would be necessary to try to solve that. But even if the money were to somehow be manufactured, Ukraine doesn't have the manpower, because consider they have to be able to have manpower behind the front lines building these fortifications. And of course, Russia is aware of this, so they're trying to use long-range fires to interdict that in any case. But they also have to have people on the front line. Well, Russia is penetrating in several places. The Kostyantynivka and Pokrovsk I mentioned there, also in Kupiansk. They are in some of the outskirts of that city in the northern part of the Eastern Front, and then down in the Kherson area, on top of what's already continuing to get kind of the pace of operations in the Sumy and the Kharkiv areas as well. So Ukraine can't just move a bunch of forces off of there, because then the Russians will accelerate their operations there. So it truly is a finger in the dike situation. All of these numbers and all this dynamic will continue to get worse and worse for the Ukraine side. So we keep coming to the same conclusion. The best interest of the Ukrainian side, the best interest of the Western alliance, the best interest of the United States is to get this war over with on the best terms available. Vladimir Putin still says, just to this day, I think yesterday he quoted again, he's still willing to talk. They're still willing to have negotiations, but they are unchanged on their terms. President Putin met with Lukashenko a day before yesterday, I think it was, and reiterated that. The door is still open for negotiations, but every time you bypass that door, the next time it comes up, the conditions get worse. They always have done that, and there's every reason to think that's going to continue to happen. Also related in terms of the war over there is this deadline that I mentioned that's coming up on August 8th. And central in that, which was referred to by Dmitry Medvedev in his tirade back against Trump, is the tariffs on China and India. And maybe India is the bigger piece here, because India is not aligned with Russia, but they're not aligned with us either. They are just doing business with everyone. They're trying to say, hey, we want to have good relations with the United States, but we also have good relations we want good relations with China. We want good relations with Russia. So they're kind of not aligning themselves with any major power, but they themselves are a rising power. So they're going to play it even, so as they say. Well, you have the likes of Lindsey Graham, who wants to put them in a choose whether you want to or not. You're either with me or you're against me, which is not a good idea. And so now that here we're coming up on August 8th is going to be when that deadline. And then the question is going to be, are we going to put these tariffs on India? Well, according to the New York Times this morning, India will buy Russian oil despite Trump's tariffs, officials say. Indian officials said on Saturday that they would keep purchasing cheap oil from Russia despite a threat of penalties from President Trump, the latest twist in an issue that New Delhi thought it had settled. So this is not a good situation, folks. There's no good place here. Again, the war is lost. Get that through your head. Everybody in the West needs to get this through your head. The war is already concluded, and in terms of the outcome, we know it. Russia won, the Ukraine side lost, and all of our support. We weren't able to stop it. It's just too late already. The conditions and the fundamentals that go into war making are irrevocably on the Russian side. You can't reverse it in our lifetimes. It's going to take a generation after the war is over before you can even talk about something else, almost like the distance between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II. Not that we're looking for anything like that, but the point being that you had a quarter of a century before anybody was ready to go back to war again. Same situation would be the case here. You can't just end World War I and then start another war, a year later. It just doesn't work that way. And in the midst of the fighting, you certainly cannot reverse the catastrophic losses the Ukraine side has suffered, both in territory, personnel killed, personnel wounded, and personnel have fled the country, millions of them. So the war is over. So why do you want to take a chance now by playing an economic card that would harm one of our, not allies, but somebody who could be our friend in the international relations, somebody who could, with some deft foreign policy, be able to maybe influence some of our adversaries, either Russia or China? I mean, if you're just thinking, what's good for us, it's going down that path right there. The last thing we should do is to make an entity like India, a country like India, that could be, if we're, it's a win-win situation where we're saying, hey, we can mutually benefit from something. Why don't you help us out with some of these difficulties here where we have less influence with the Russia or China? That's what we should be doing. But instead, we're literally putting them in a position, if we follow through with this on the 8th of August, to put them in a position where it's like, hey, choose us or them. And they may say, okay, if you're going to force me, I'm choosing them, because I think that's where my future lies. You are hoping, again, almost like this roulette table, that the pressure and the trying to compel somebody's actions against their national interest for our national interest is going to work. I think it's pretty unlikely that's going to work, and that is going to worsen the situation. And why would you take the risk of something like that when it wouldn't matter anyway? If you succeeded, if you got India to stop buying Russian oil, that's not going to end the war. That's not going to cause Russia to agree to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. That will never happen unless there's some other dramatic change on the battlefield, but not because of finances. Russia will find a way around that, like they always have. They will make sacrifices. They will make cuts. They will do whatever they need to do. They have the natural resources on their own to continue fighting no matter what. So it is beyond foolish to even think about having this rupture in American-Indian relations, which could only harm our own economy and our own international standing. Just don't do it.